All right. Well, thank you very much, Adam. We'll see how uplifting this is as we go along. I make no promises. Um, so thank you again for the invitation. I'm really pleased to spend this time with everyone this afternoon. I actually have a bit of a slide deck here, which I will begin sharing here in a second. Okay. So can I get, just for those who, a thumbs up that you can hear me and you're now seeing a slide with me pondering some wine. Good. I spend an inordinate amount of time in this kind of a position, and it's rendered some insights. It's created some challenges too. And so what I thought I would do is take the time and rather than go through some of the specific projects that we're doing in the EcoGastronomy group, I wanted to kind of take us back a bit to a broader frame of reference and kind of share with you some of the thoughts that led to this new initiative of mine, and perhaps get some feedback. So EcoGastronomy is the name of the research group that I lead at UVic. It takes its name from eco, the ecology, and the observation that food, wine, etc., are all products of ecological processes, and therefore gastronomy is an extension of ecology, and where those two meet is where this research group is situated. So I, along with Eric Higgs, who I see joining us today, as we are both in the School of Environmental Studies at UVic, and I also have a external appointment at just a wonderful small university in Angers, France, École Supérieure d'Agriculture in Angers. And there I teach in their Masters of Food Identity, which is essentially the idea that food, it's a very, not surprisingly, French idea, that food has an identity, and I'll spend a good deal of time talking about that today, and also in the International Vintage Master Program. So these are both graduate programs targeted at the place-based nature of both food and wine. So by way of an entree into all of this, I thought it might be interesting I found it interesting, at least, to go back and kind of retrace my steps, how I got to this place. And so I grew up in Toronto, downtown, and through the late 1970s, early 80s, the shades of the white Anglo-Saxon sort of persona of Toronto began to lift. And the idea that Toronto was actually far more diverse, it was obvious for anybody with eyes to see, but it wasn't really part of the narrative of the city. And that began to change in the late 70s and through the 80s. It was really a global sort of bouillabaisse of cultures. In my junior high, there was 42 native tongues. And as a white native English speaker, I was very much in the minority, which is a bit of a twist on the kind of narrative that we often are faced with these days. And more to the point, the ethnic restaurants in the downtown core began being patronized by people outside of the cultural communities that had formerly been the major clientele. And I began working in kitchens at this time, part-time, one restaurant after another, discovering what seemed like a limitless diversity of foods, and preparation techniques and technologies and customs and traditions and so on. So it was a really, I didn't realize at the time, but looking back, it was a very powerful sort of shaping of my consciousness around food. I eventually found my way to Europe and um, worked in some kitchens there. And this was probably one of the more profound experiences working with. This is Saldano, who I'm standing with, and a verified, legitimate Habsburg prince. And he's passed on now, unfortunately, but he was as much philosopher as chef. And with his own very complicated background, we had lots of discussions around the meaning of food, the identity of food, the broader context of food, and of course, being in Florence, that um, automatically comes with the process, but he took it to a brand new level, and so was very influential in a development of my thinking around food. But life happens, and different trajectories came into play, and found myself through a series of circumstances um, moving off in a different direction into ecology, and particularly conservation ecology, to decades of research, as was mentioned, the salmon issues on this coast and salmon farms, and the implications of those, in addition to the anthropogenic impacts on large carnivores, and the list goes on and on, the kind of stuff that you would expect an ecologist to be doing. Um, and at the core of all of this was the study of biodiversity, and specifically its creation. How is diversity created? How is it maintained? And or not, as the case often is, and what are the implications of all of that? And it took a surprisingly long time before I realized that I was asking the same questions as an ecologist as I was asking as a novice in the culinary world. Essentially, why are things here different from things over here? Right? How does this system, why does this system function differently and is comprised of different entities versus over here? Right? And it's exactly the same kinds of things an ecologist. Well, as an ecologist uses different terms and different tools, but it's fundamentally a similar exercise. And began this trip down a road to look at the macro scale, or the generalizable mechanisms that underline the creation of diversity. And so I'll start with an ecologist's view of this, and then we'll slowly morph into a broader context. Uh-oh. Hold on. Sorry about that. I need to turn off the. We're coming off, as everybody's aware, we've been sort of dealing with COVID, and so I've got some um, for some of these slides show up in talks in lectures, and so there's sometimes there's a taped narrative that goes along with that. Hopefully, that won't show up too often. Anyway, so we've got plant photosynthetic um, um, issues here first and foremost, that define the ecological context of the creation of diversity. And I'm going to keep coming back to this idea of inefficiency, the notion that in wild plants, for example, the conversion of, so not cultivated plants, the conversion of sunlight to biological available energy is, peaks out at around 2%. Right? So from a a energetic point, an energetic efficiency point of view, that's a pretty modest number. Crop plants that are crop plants because they are more efficient at harnessing that energy and turning it into biological available energy, average around 1 to 2%, and sugarcane being a significant exception, up to 8%. So sugarcane is kind of sits way out on its own. on average, we're looking at a production system that is 2% efficient. And so the takeaway here is that energy is by and large very limited in these systems. If we ignore clouds and um, look at the daily average availability of energy on a landscape, we're looking at about 1 calorie per square meter per day. That's the energy budget of herbivores, which are the next level of trophic webs or food webs. And so when we start looking at this um, on a large scale, the inefficiency of the biologic systems is the creation of diversity because we have a very, very small supply of energy and a massive relative to the supply demand for that. Right. And so we can think of this in the classic economics 101 supply demand curve, right? Supply increases, demand and thus competition decline. But if supply is very, very limited, which is the case in any ecological system, then demand must be quite high. If we add to this the fact that every population, every organism within every population, whether we're talking about bacteria to elephants and everything in between, every population has the capacity to grow exponentially, right? In other words, to grow infinitely, as demarked in the red. However, resources are not infinitely available. And so any population will find a plateau of population abundance at the so called carrying capacity of the environment. So that's the reality. And so, built into the ecology of every species is the biological imperative to outstrip its resources. Right? Every increment of additional resource made available is immediately saturated. And this can conceivably or theoretically go on into infinity. Of course, that's not what happens, but it just undermines or underlines this premise that competition is the preeminent factor in ecological systems. Another takeaway is that every species, through evolution, finds its best way to solve the energy challenge. Right. And so we have a finite amount of energy that is harnessed by plants. And then we have herbivores whose benefit is, well, I've got lots to eat. I'm a herbivore, but the value, the nutritional and food value of that is typically rather low. Or I can be a carnivore or a predator of some sort higher up and say, I am going to target high value, high nutrition food. However, its abundance is much lower. Right? So there's no absolute win situation here. Everything is a trade-off in ecology. But if you trace it back to the roots, the fundamental driver of all of this is the inefficiency of biological systems in harnessing energy and the inefficiency of ecological systems in the transfer of energy. So you can see this pyramid is shaped such that we have large amounts of biomass of plant material and then a smaller biomass of herbivores and then a smaller amount of the secondary consumers not as we go up. This is essentially the explanation of why nature does not make a large number of big fierce animals, because the ecological cost of every gram of tissue at the highest level of that food chain is incredibly expensive. So we take 2 points away from this: competition structures ecological systems, and innovations that reduce that competition, in other words, adaptations, increase reproductive success. The more energy I can take in, the more babies I will have. My babies will have the genetic structures that allowed me success, and that is how evolution operates. But I find this to be a striking example of the idea of I mean, inefficiency has a connotation of a negative, like things that are inefficient are automatically thought of as being negative, and not necessarily. As I said, this is at the heart, the engine of diversity. But what this is showing you is the amount of primary productivity, i.e., plants, necessary to support animals on the planet. So 450 gigatons of plants are necessary to support 2 gigatons of animals. And then down here is this the square of all, or 2 squares of all animals, which are then expanded here to show you how they break out in terms of the various taxa. The bottom line is that it takes a huge amount of plants harnessing energy to make this system work in any kind of way that we understand. And so to put that onto something a little bit more digestible, let's say, here's the degradation of energy through the system as we move from in the ocean, primary producers in the form of phytoplankton, to 100 grams of tuna that would go into a sandwich. Every, every time something eats something else, we're losing 90% of that stock. And so it takes 10,000 kilos of primary productivity in the form of phytoplankton to make enough tuna for one lunch. Because every time we move up a rung in the ladder, we're losing 90%. That has massive implications to how ecological systems are structured. So if we go back to our supply demand curve, right, this is the realm of ecological systems. Very small supply driving massive demand. And it also drives or creates the motivation to find ways around that energy problem. And that is the root of evolution. So competition is exceedingly intense. Capturing efficiency, so the inefficiency of plants to be able to harness energy, and then the transfer of energy. Every time something eats something else, 90% of that energy that's captured is lost. Well, that sounds like a pretty challenging place to be. One question that arises is, if competition is so powerful and evolution is so strong, why is there not a single set of homogeneous super competitors that basically are spread across the planet? Right? If competition is this all-powerful structuring phenomena, then surely those subsets of species that are super competitors should be found spread all over the world and dominating the landscape. Now, of course, we are humans are an example of that, right? But I'm speaking to more of the biological nature. Why is that? Right? Why do we have diversity? The answer is because this competition unfolds across innumerable heterogeneous, in other words, bounded areas. A strategy that works here is unlikely to be as successful over here under a different ecological context. These bounded areas is important. The idea of boundaries is something I'll come back to in the not too distant future. For now, the point being that when we look at a diverse habitat, as such as in this picture, we can immediately, I think, understand that a strategy that works in a dense forest is not going to be the same strategy or achieve the same level of success in um, a riparian area or in a wetland, et cetera, et cetera. To drive that point home, there's two pictures from Toronto Zoo from outdoor exhibits. So we've got the polar bear and a lion. And while it's true that things like water and temperature that we know obviously differ across landscapes give structure to the Earth's biota and are responsible in part for the creation of diversity, they don't necessarily affect the organisms directly. Polar bears are restricted to the far north and lions to the African savanna because of the indirect effects of temperature and water and the communities of organisms that they each find themselves among. Both have thrived to or have evolved, have adapted to the particular contexts they find themselves in. Right, so a polar bear is ill suited to chase down gazelle on the savannah. Likewise, a lion is going to starve trying to hunt lions on ice packs. Both find a Toronto winter completely within their physiological um, capacities. Right, it's not that the Toronto winter is too cold for the lion or too warm, I suppose, for a polar bear. The summer is too warm for the polar bear, et cetera, et cetera. It's that for these two organisms to achieve their greatest potential, they would be in the environments that gave rise to their differences in the first place, right? The root of diversity. So, does this explain only biological diversity? So now we're switching away from the rather focused lens of an ecologist. I'll speak briefly about cultural evolution. Does biological evolution drive cultural evolution? Well, the conduits of transfer, of information transfer for a biologist, ecologist, is DNA, right? That's why progeny look like parents, and if parents were successful, then in providing some of that success is coded in the genome, then that success can be literally passed on to subsequent generations, and that's how things adapt and change through time. But in the cultural realm, language is the conduit of information. So anthropologists use language as a proxy of DNA, and then when the language changes, then that is a boundary between two cultures. Because if they're not communicating, then they are progressing along to different evolutionary trajectories. So here's a thought experiment. We have ecological processes that are bounded inside a particular area. And these ecological processes are shaped by all the relevant biological and physical parameters that are specific to that place. The hypothesis is then there is a cultural coevolution between the culture and that environment. Let's say we have a physical um, something physical on the landscape, like a mountain, that would separate these two areas and create different ecological contexts, right? So on one side, high rainfall, on the other side, low rainfall. Does that different ecological context manifest different cultural contexts, right? Are they linked? Well, we can test that. We can say, does a biological community boundary match cultural community boundaries? And second, do human cultural diversity should be higher, in other words, more dense in biophysically heterogeneous landscapes and lower in homogeneous landscapes, right? If everything is linked to this idea of diversity of bounded spaces, right, we should be able to see the link. And We can do this using both DNA and the study of language and as a proxy for distributions of cultures. So on the top, we've got language diversity density, and the warmer the color, the greater the density, the greater number of languages, i.e. cultures per a given area. And on the bottom panel is species diversity density, same general pattern. So you can see in areas that have high species diversity density map quite nicely to areas where language diversity density also is maximized. Perhaps a even more striking example in the color contours is a measure of plant diversity. So again, plants are where we typically go because they are the root of the entire um, ecological system. Greater the plant diversity, greater diversity of other things that will be associated with them. But the dots are actually the centers of ellipses of cultures. So the geographic center of a language family. And you can see where the colors get darker. In other words, plant diversity increases, the dots become denser as well. So it would appear we have a fairly nice relationship between biodiversity, species diversity, and cultural diversity. And it's not limited to simply um, this relationship between human cultures and biota as a whole. We look at amphibians and we look at birds and we look at mammals and we see, of course, there are going to be some differences, but the coarse grain relationships remain. Those areas that are high diversity for all taxa. So here's an outline of British Columbia. And so why is British Columbia, particularly in the context of Canada or even North America, considered a biodiversity hotspot? Because of the rich diversity of biogeoclimatic zones. So unlike most politically defined boundaries across North America, British Columbia is unique for the diversity of the physical environments that are contained within this political boundary. And as a result, we have a much elevated biodiversity as a result. As the physical environment diversifies, so too then would biotic communities. Well, what about human communities? Turns out that there is a nice parallel at this smaller scale between First Nation language groups and cultural boundaries that are predicted quite nicely by the biogeophysical boundaries of the province. And so, I mean, and I don't think this isn't particularly earth shattering for anybody, right? But I'm just drawing all of this together and saying that there is this relationship that is driving all of these interrelationships. So, mi chiamo Volpe. See, I'm Italian by heritage. I spend as much time in Italy as I can. So let's turn to Italy, which is where all of this thinking began so many years ago. So here's the political entity that we know as Italy. Italy is a very long, narrow country situated along a north-south axis. And so up in the north, we have, in addition to mountains, which then amplify the effect of a more northern latitude, so a more temperate environment, moving through down to the south, where it becomes almost neotropical in the southern extents. But the variation in Italy goes much deeper than that. There is, in addition to this north-south gradient, we have a central axis of mountains that separates the windward and the leeward sides of the country or of the peninsula, creating very different um, ecological and physical realities on either side. And then because there are mountainous regions along these spines, we also have altitudinal gradients along with all this other source of variation. On top of which, we have a very complicated um, geologic history that creates very different soils and therefore plants that are going to be associated with each of these different soil types. And a rich tapestry of cultural history. Lots and lots of fighting and boundaries being set up and broken down and then recombined such that these are the various language families that currently exist in Italy. And so the broad colors up at the top, the purples and the yellows and the browns and the oranges, those are the broad families. And then the smaller areas inside are the particular languages. And so these languages and their boundaries can be traced or have been traced back to various points in history when there were literally cultural divides. So we have a rich tapestry of geospatial and biological and cultural diversity um, in Italy, which is the geophysical complexity leads to biological diversity. The biological diversity times this continuous political recombination, let's call it, has ended up producing this grand scale of biocultural diversity. And it's created this multitude of diversity, not just in cultures, but in food. Right? There are 400 olive varieties in Italy. And it's not because for some reason Italy is a mecca of biological diversification of olives. It's directly related to this cultural recombination on top of a very diverse physical environment that supported the creation of all of this diversity. There's 350 wine varieties in commercial production. In commercial production, there's 350. There's 2,000 that have been described. All for the reasons I've just described. So at this point, I just want to kind of have like a little check-in. And we've got the idea of hierarchies that we've already introduced in the form of the relationships between the primary producers and primary consumers and secondary consumers and so on up the chain. And this idea of boundaries or spatial diversity across the globe. When we look at these two together in the context of a severely limited energy flow system, these are the underlying mechanisms that give rise to ecological function. Let me expand on that a little bit further. So here's Pliny the Elder's quite famous book from where he states, "In wine there is truth. In vino veritas." What very rarely gets added to is the rest of the sentence, which is, "In water there is good sense," right? But people seem to forget the water part and concentrate on the fact that there might be actually truth in wine and go hard on that. So grapes and wine grapes and wine is something of a long-term sort of preoccupation for me, because there is no other species that is so responsive to microscale environmental variation, right? That we change the slightest parameter of the growing conditions of the grape. We add a little bit more clay to the soil. We change the hydrology a little bit. We decrease the degree days or increase them a little bit, or whatever the case may be. The smallest little changes manifest in distinctly different products at the end of fermentation. There's no other species that is so susceptible, so responsive to these tiny, tiny changes in environmental variation. Now, of course, we lead the pack in terms of ability of creating environmental variation. Right? And so you put these two things together and you end up with lists like this that are the recognized wines in the top two tiers, quality tiers, the so-called quality tiers of Italian wines, broken out by the various provinces. Tremendous amounts of variation, only possible due to the millennia of manipulations of the Italian peninsula in pursuit of these wines, and Vitis vinifera, the wine grape's ability to respond to such fine scale manipulations. So these are often referred to as the terroir of the wine. Right? The wines are an expression of the land, the terroir. That was first um, the first critical examination of that was by Jean Anselme Brillat-Savarin in his Physiology of Taste, produced in 1826. And he was for the first, at least the first that I'm aware of, to make clear the reciprocity of environmental health and the health of the human condition. So human health expressed in a broader context than just the physical health, right? The health of the mind, the health of the soul, etc. And this book is more philosophical treatise than anything. Unfortunately, it's only remembered broadly because of for those who might know of the kitsch Japanese television show Iron Chef. In Chairman Kaga's kitchen, he is famously starts each show with "Tell me what you eat, and I'll tell you what you are," which is the start of Savarin's book. And so, placed in France, this book began to explore why France experienced or was defined by such diversity that that even in the 1800s, early 1800s, was clear to everyone as being sort of fundamental to the fabric of France. And it's not because of the Mesozoic clash of the African and Iberian and Eurasian tectonic plates, which then gave rise to this very complicated geologic foundation of France, although that obviously plays into it. It's a fundamental precondition. So back to our ideas that the physical variation is a precondition to driving diversity, but it's actually more than that. Brilliant Savarin's conversations began a reflection that would sort of become a naturalization of taste in France. So this is the Gourmand's Code, a complete manual of gastronomy from 1829. So this is a year after Napoleon's death and 20 or so years before the revolution. And in this book is a foldout of a map of France, like geo-referenced by the particular specialties of each of these places. And the distillation of the book is exactly what I've just tried to explain in as brief a time as possible, that the particular ecological and cultural contexts that each of these communes finds itself in have pursued different trajectories in pursuit of particular specialties. The and this was something um, of a change in mindset for France. It was it articulated what everybody knew, but not um, but had not been articulated before. So journalists and cookbook writers and chefs all found a natural alliance with taste producers. So the winemakers, the cheese makers, the bakers, the cooks, the farmers of all stripes, all found themselves in in a collaborative relationship that defined the French narrative of itself. And the Belle Epoque was an age of rapid modernity in France. The beautiful period saw, urbanization and migration from field to city. But the farm city dichotomy also reinforced the notion of where France's soul resided. It was in the paysan, the peasant, the agrarian roots. And so the homogenizing elements of the city were seen as certainly progress, but not and could not be at the cost of homogenizing what made France France. And that was the peasant. And this became just shockingly clear in 1985 in the World Economic Summit when the talks broke down between the US and France, particularly around trade subsidies and agricultural subsidies. And the wildly popular ag minister at the time, a fellow by the name of Rocard, um, was in a press conference after the collapse of these talks, and you can look, just look at Reagan, and you can pretty much figure out how things are going. He said, "We have done good work for our peasants today in the collapse of this agricultural treaty or would-be agricultural treaties," and the Americans were stunned. I mean, Reagan's face says it all. What do peasants have to do with any of this? Right? International trade markets and foreign debt and exchange, et cetera, et cetera. Why would an otherwise savvy political leader pander to a political non-entity in the French populace, not realizing that he was speaking to the entire country? Right? It was a testament that the idea of the peasant, quote unquote, remains a potent symbol of French culture, and one in which the ideas are of what being French are projected and legitimized. The ties that bind every French citizen are the soil, the terroir, right? The idea that France is an amalgam of diversity, and these kinds of negotiations were seen as potential threats to that. So, in short, the paysan, the peasant, is the soul of France. But the Belle Epoque, the period of urbanization and progress into the modern world, was defined by drinking champagne. To drink champagne was a stake to stake your claim in a civilized life. And champagne had already, been in international markets for a long time and was rapidly growing. But unlike still wines, the making of quality champagne requires at least 5 years from harvest to sale, and in many cases, considerably longer than that. So it's very capital intensive, which led to the rise of the champagne house, which were backed by bourgeois families with deep pockets that could sustain that kind of investment to see production through from start to end. But but at the end, also reaping all the financial rewards. So at this time, champagne, quote unquote, was produced and sold across France, but only in the region of Reims and Epernay, the now classical and recognized champagne region, were these traditional methods followed. And so here's a list of all the champagnes that you're probably familiar with. Right? These are all champagne houses. In other words, these are not products of the place, these are products of the corporation. And each are produced so as to produce a product that is associated with the tastes of the company, less so the place. Right? So they're all blends. And the reason I'm telling you this is because the vineyards, the vine farmers began to see grapes and soil as the only means of controlling what they saw as the appropriation of champagne, and as an extension, a threat to the agrarian soul of France. That through the champagne houses, moving away from targeting or producing a product that is an expression of a place and its people, now is an expression of a brand. That was, we just can't have that. On top of which, champagne was now being, the name champagne was being appropriated by, everybody far and wide, trying to ride the coattails of what was seen as a superior product. And so here, an example of a California champagne. So in 1905 and 1908, a couple of laws were passed to protect against fraud, that only champagne made in a particular area, according to the traditional ways, um, could be used to, or could be called champagne. And and champagne was granted the status, the first to be sort of regionally demarcated. Right? So a name and a place in modern French law was, Champagne was the first. But the initial boundaries that these laws set forth were very broad and failed to take into account any notion of quality or any notion of tradition, or guidelines of how grapes could be grown, the density of grapes grown, basically any reflection of the history and the culture that gave rise to the product in the first place. And this erupted in tremendous upheaval in the so-called Champagne riots through 1910 and 1911. And again, it was the peasants uprising to um, rein in what they saw as an existential threat to not only themselves, but the soul of France. So enter this fella who was Minister of Agriculture just long enough to start one of the most influential institutions in not only France, but influential institutions across the entire breadth of the food world, and the introduction of the Institute of Appellations. This idea that appellations, that products that are that are the products that reflect a particular place and a people, deserve special protection. So by 1935, this notion of terroir was no longer just a descriptive, but also descriptive of a place, but also tied to quality and authenticity. And it's interesting that in the context of quality is not, is it better in some way than some other product, but quality in the sense of, is it as an authentic representation or articulation of a people and a place than this other thing. What a different way of thinking about quality. And so today, that initially French intervention has now been adopted by the EU, and we have protected designations of origin or protected geographical indications. So these are two flavors of the same thing, basically identifying products that are unique, um, of a place and a people, and even things that are not food in the TSG designation can be so protected. And so here's two camemberts, one a sort of industrial fabrication that bears no adherence to the traditional ways of producing camembert, which arise from Normandy, and one which, as you can see, bears the PDO stamp, which suggests that this is a product that is produced by the old methods. But also, right, there is a cost. And so this is one of the fundamental sort of take home messages here, that through the advance of technology and efficiencies, yes, we can produce perhaps more food or food more cheaply, But the cost of that is quality, at least measured in the terms of the degree to which that product reflects the history and the traditions which gave rise to it in the first place. The very first product that ever had any kind of protection under law, now in this case, long before sort of modern French law, we're going back to the late 1400s, early 1500s, was Roquefort cheese. When it was realized that the particular microbes of the caves around the town of Roquefort gave, gave rise to a cheese unlike any other cheese that was produced in the surrounding regions. And the king at the time bequeathed the name Roquefort as a protected name in the marketplace for the cheeses of those particular caves only. Think of the San Marzano tomato, the tomatoes that grow in the at the foot of Mount Vesuvius that are world renowned to be superior, the best. If you're making tomato sauce, you want San Marzano tomatoes. However, they must be grown within a delineated area, Mount Vesuvius, and under certain contexts which limit the density of production and so on and so forth. So, because there's a limitation there, the competition in the marketplace sees advantage to using the name without providing the product. And so you can see here we have San Marzano type tomatoes, product of Canada, versus the real San Marzano tomatoes with the seal of both the DOP and the producing organization that oversees it. Not surprisingly, a significant price difference between the two, but also a very different experience in terms of the product and what it produces. And so I'll finish up with a quick discussion on this idea of geographic indicators as being the bulwark against those forces that are kind of undermining sustainability and diversity and so forth. So geographic indicators, or appellations we might call them, are legally recognized as intellectual property rights. They came into being through a number of treaties now um, quite a while ago. But the take home here is that all WTO member states, of which Canada is one, must provide legal protections to other countries' geographical indicators. And there's roughly 10,000 out there right now, mostly in the food and ag world. And they represent north of $50 billion of trade annually. Why this is all relevant is because we have just signed a treaty with the EU that not only removes 98% of the pre-existing tariffs, but it also codifies GIs and appellations in Canadian law. And it compels Canada to create a GI framework, basically recognizing that there are boundaries, and within those boundaries are products that are unique by virtue of being from that place. And as a result, there are hard limits on intensities of production and the various challenges that lead to the homogenization of our food and our way of life. Technology, in admittedly oversimplified perspective, has erased the friction of time and space. We can now be anywhere at any time. Things move frictionlessly. And we've been shown that particularly now in the times of COVID, where things have dramatically shifted in that direction. And so, while the sort of modern sort of liberalism as a political philosophy may urge the erasure, the erasing of boundaries and hierarchies, and for many good reasons, biological systems are defined by boundaries, and their viability depends on those boundaries being maintained. Indeed, our continued survival and quality of life and vis-a-vis food security are in jeopardy as these boundaries are eliminated and the friction of space and time become reduced and space and time become collapsed. And so terroir is this physical manifestation of coevolution of people in their place inside this bounded area. the emergence of terroir, or the emergence of place-based characters, is as inevitable as the emergence of biodiversity itself. They are two sides of the same coin, and they're under threat by the same process. That we have GIs, or whatever political or legal entity or tool you might wish to apply, signifies a product or a process that is place based, has a specific geographical origin, and the products of those processes have unique characters that are related to that place. That's the underlying driver of these initiatives, and they are both biological and cultural. And as soon as we erase these boundaries, we also put in place a very large challenge to ourselves. As homogeneity increases, so does the brittleness of the system. And so I'll end there. I know I've kind of threw a lot at you there, and this is an underlying these ideas sort of underline the overall trajectory of the research group at UVic, and the kinds of things that we're doing. And I've worked with the Galiano Conservancy in past on fisheries issues and so on, and hopefully um, with this new addition to the lab, I know there are folks in the conservancy that are also interested in these kinds of issues around the food forest being a key example, and other things. And so hopefully this pivot doesn't take me away from the conservancy, but instead offers uh, a new vehicle for engagement. So I'll end it there, and happy to take questions or comments.
Thanks so much, John. That was a totally fascinating talk, and reminded me very much of sitting in your class way back when, the connections through just kind of the basics of ecology and this topic that maybe not all of us associate with those kinds of
Given the economic
fundamentals.
stratification, how does the development of GIs and terroir affect food availability and price for people not able to increase their food budget? Right. So you bring up a really good question. So the protection of well, they whatever protections a GI or some kind of recognition that farmers are more than just conduits of a commodity production. um, and I chose not to include the work that we're doing on farmer mental health, and but one of the upshots that comes that is impossible to ignore even at these early stages, is that those producers, those farmers that are engaged in production systems where their food actually maintains identity through the value chain, not only make more money, but are far more happy, consider themselves much more optimistic, and are more likely to continue farming, as opposed to those that are engaged in a identityless commodity, tend to fall negative on that side of things. So that's the production side. Your question is more on the consumer side, and does this necessarily add to what is already or can be a significant challenge? The My response to that is that we pay. So we in North America, and the U.S. especially is the world leader in the amount they don't pay. What am I trying to say? The proportion of income used to buy food, we are at the bottom of that list. Right, the U.S. is number one, um, less than well, we won't get into the numbers, a tiny fraction of income. Canada is right behind, roughly half of that in that one might expect to pay in France and Italy and Spain. And so my response is that the there are systemic challenges that need to be overcome, not least of which is the corporatization of the value chain, and the incredible challenge there is for regional and local producers to service regional and local communities. And so it's not that the challenge is not, well, how are people going to afford food if we produce better food? Because that's essentially what I'm saying is, we produce a range of, let's say, qualities of food. And now I'm actually talking, more regular metrics of quality. Um, and I don't see any benefit in reserving cheap, low value, low quality food for folks that are financially impoverished. That doesn't seem like the way to go. And I'm not also saying that we need to buff up and polish the niche producers providing super fine scale niche food for for those who are well heeled. What I'm doing is drawing attention to the fact that there are these production systems elsewhere in the world that have found a far more equitable balance between the two, that for a small percentage of increase in what one pays for food, you receive a dramatically outsized return on that investment, not only in the food quality, but in the production chain itself, where there is a future for farming um, and um, and feedback loops that ensure resiliency in the production. So I know I'm dancing around your question, but it's not the the issue is not where food is too expensive. It simply can't be. We're already food is nowhere in the world cheaper than it is here. And so obviously we need to look elsewhere for solving that issue.
John, I've got a question for you from Celeste. I'm going to unmute her.
Sure. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed this talk. I'm a second year
You're
biology.
on mute, Celeste.
No, she's not muted. Can you hear us? Can you hear me, John? Now she's muted. Hey, Celeste, can you hear me? Great. Can you turn yourself? I'll unmute you. Let's see.
Does that work now?
That works just fine. I think John can't hear us. And his silence is making me think that too.
My audio is not off, I don't think.
Well, if you can't hear us and you can't hear Celeste.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Can you hear us now?
I'm back now. Yes.
Oh, great.
Sorry.
Excellent. Okay, go ahead, Celeste.
Perfect. First off, thank you for the wonderful lecture. I'm a second year biology environmental studies student, so a lot of this is super relevant to the education I will be pursuing. I have a question regarding kind of both GIs and land conservancy. So in Italy, they clearly have established this need for GIs and protected basically product protection, so that it's important that a certain product comes from a certain place. But kind of moving away from the product and production side of things, do you think there's any way that GIs could be useful in places such as Canada, where we're not necessarily making products specific to a region, but recognizing that a region produces very specific and important cultural things?
In fact, I would say the GIs, the main thrust of a GI is the protection of a culture.
Okay.
Because without the culture, you don't have the product, right? And so you could conceivably produce a product that materially checks all the boxes without protecting the culture, right? And that would be not. I mean, that's antithetical to the entire raison d'etre of the program. And so the underlying theory is that if you produce the culture and the functionality of the culture, which appreciating that there are boundaries and there are hierarchies, which is a can be a political challenge, but be that as it may, that then the you position the culture and the individuals in a position to best benefit themselves, right?
Mhm.
Rather than so many would, particularly in the wine industry, have pushed back on this whole notion because they see it as stymieing innovation.
Mm.
Because if we are tied to tradition, then by definition we cannot innovate or take advantage of modern technologies or other innovations of other sorts. And absolutely, that's a point of friction, and needs to be addressed or at least acknowledged. Um, I see GIs, first and foremost, as a tremendous opportunity for First Nations. That here is now about to be codified in law. Even though we signed this a number of years ago, it's still it moves as fast as you think government might move. But it is slowly becoming codified in law that we have legal instruments that connect cultures and products and simultaneously protect both.
Mhm.
And it's made it's literally it's made for issues such as those that many First Nations face in protecting their cultures and the material products of those cultures.
Okay. So do you think it's possible that in the future, once this does become more of a legal backdrop, and that GIs could be used in a sense to protect First Nations and their specific lands, even if they don't necessarily produce a commercial product from the land, because they produce products for themselves as part of their culture, but they're not necessarily like consumer products that other people might use, but to use them as a way to further
If
strengthen territory
I got you.
technology?
I got you. I got you. I don't know. I mean, that's we're getting into the weeds on the legalities. However, I think of this example. There's a particular wine DO just south of Rome that, and their DO, so they're effectively their appellation, um, stipulates that the vines must be grown on poplar trees. So they can't use the typical trellising and all the things that make wine growing much more straightforward and easy. Um, they must use to produce this wine and to use the name that is associated with this wine. The wines must be produced the same way the Etruscans, not the Romans, the Etruscans produced the wine. And so you've got vines that are like 20 feet in the air. I mean, how do you how do you cultivate these things? How do you harvest them? It's ridiculous, and the wine is it's marginal at best because they have to create this wine and to be authentic to the history. They must use techniques that actually prevent the optimization of the wine, at least to the modern palate. So there's not a huge market for this wine, but it is a pride. It is a source of pride and fierce pride for the communities that produce it because it is their touchstone to a distant past. So what I'm saying is that for these systems to work, there is not a necessity for a ready market to sell into. The mere production satisfies the if you produce it and you produce it in these ways that are stipulated, presumably prescribed to reflect the historical and traditional ways that gave rise to the product in the first place, then it is protected. Now, whether you sell it or consume it or put it on a shelf, whatever, that's secondary.
Okay. Thank you very much. I may have more questions, but I'll let other people have their turn.
I've got a question from Suzanne, and I hope nobody from that part of Italy heard you describe their wine as marginal at best.
Well, I don't think I'm in too much risk there. They'll admit it too.
All right, here's Suzanne.
Thanks so much, John. That was just an excellent excellent talk. And I'm calling today from North Galiano. And it's been too long, by the way, John, since you paid us a visit up here. Have to speak to Professor Higgs and about that. But I'm really fascinated by this concept of terroir and of protection for both indigenous products, since we have the Nutsamat forage forest at the Conservancy. And also Galiano has such a vibrant economy of farmers, and now farmers matching their products to culinary demands with new exciting sort of farm to table restaurants popping up. So I'm just hoping that maybe this is something that could enter our discourse, Adam, in terms of speaking with the Penelakut and other indigenous groups, whether it's something like soapberry or nettles, something that is distinctively indigenous that might be protected in a way. And also, if we could start to identify among the members of the Galiano farming community what is distinctive for us, because there are so many very top-notch food producers now on the island. But I just had one question also, just with respect to the concept of terroir. I mean, as you know, the Gulf Islands are starting to produce some fairly respectable wines. Would you have a sense of whether, say, Pender, Galiano, Salt Spring would all have different terroirs if they were to be identified as a protected source of origin? Because the soils are quite different and the conditions can be quite different from Gulf Island to Gulf Island or to Southern Vancouver Island.
I know I overloaded the talk as it was. And so I chose not, I mean, I had to find some things to drop. And that's one of the things I dropped is we have another series of research projects going on right now that are asking that very question. So we're working in the Cowichan Valley, though I would expect the Gulf Islands would, if anything, show even greater ranges of diversification. And it is all to do with this idea of what is terroir in a new world concept. I mean, we don't have millennia to fall back on, and these processes and these things are a product through literally evolutionary time, right? Our industry is decades, a few decades old at best.
Just a brief interjection. Perhaps we have millennia with respect to, say, camas production by indigenous people.
It absolutely, but I'm speaking wine. So yeah. In that context, we are, some students of mine are engaged in a project that that has brought in dozens of sommeliers and everything to get their feedback on these, the terroir of wine, and we actually manipulated grapevines in such a way to see if the response, the differences in the wine are a treatment effect of the grapevines, or is it a soil effect? Is the signal a place effect? And not surprisingly, yes, how you manage the grapes, how you manage the vines creates some differences, but the biggest difference is where they are. And so it basically it reinforces this idea that terroir is an interplay between human intervention in the landscape and the specific qualities of the place in question. And we're talking about physical distances that are measured in well, in some cases within the same vineyard, right? So we're getting signals that create differences of the sort that you don't normally see outside Burgundy. So yeah, there's absolutely I think reason to expect those kinds of differences in the Gulf Islands. And back to the terroir, or because terroir kind of has a some people find it a little bit precious, and so they use geographic indicators, GIs, instead. They're saying the same thing nominally. The legal ecosystem that all of this plays out in is that the GI is an IP. It's an intellectual property. It is not a reflection of a material phenomena or context in a place. It's intellectual, and therefore it starts with the people. But the product is a product of coevolution of some sort between those people and the place that creates a product that is discernible or can be differentiated from other like products. And so then there's where we get into the difference between trademarks and GIs and so forth. So a trademark speaks to the company, speaks to the means of production, whether that production is on Galiano or in China. That's a trademark, as opposed to a GI, which has root literally in a place and takes into account or captures the people of that place, because it is an IP. It's not a soil composition or something of that sort.
Well, thank you. It's a fascinating topic. Lots of food and drink for thought. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
I see that Professor Eric Higgs has his hand raised. So,
oh, here it comes.
Now you're in trouble.
Yeah, bring it on.
And I'm sorry, I shouldn't really be hogging airtime today, because you and I do have a chance to speak fairly often, but I wanted to make an observation and then ask you a question. The observation is that I think the Galiano Conservancy's intuition in its work at the Millard Learning Center was to tie ecological restoration together with food security and food production. And I think that's really been fascinating to watch that unfold. And I think the framework that you've given us today actually helps to provide a stronger conceptual linkage between those two. I think that could be really helpful. And what Suzanne was suggesting around, maybe I can't even imagine the amount of work it would take to start to move on one of these, GIs or whatever, but it could be very interesting to pursue that and also to think about where this would go for the Conservancy. But anyway, my question is around slow food. And I'm seeing Wild Mountain Thyme on here. Is that Brooke on the call?
Yeah, it's Brooke lurking back there.
Yeah, lurking there. But I know you've been involved with slow food. Brooke certainly has been. Other people have, but I haven't heard so much about it recently. But their Arc of Taste is done, does a lot of what you've been describing today. And I'm wondering if you can comment on that, John.
Yeah, so I imagine Slow Food is an organization that's known to most. They came into being in response to the opening of the first McDonald's in Italy at the base of the Spanish Steps in Rome. It was seen as the thin edge of the wedge of the destruction and homogenization of Italian culture. In response, there was this massive sort of grassroots upwelling that over time morphed into this organization, now global organization called Slow Food. And the general concepts of it are articulated in many of the things that I talked about, that food, good, clean, good, clean, wholesome, good, clean, something food, is a product of a people and a place, right? That is not something that can be manufactured absent identity of place and people. So the slow food world continues to evolve, and it has an arc of taste, which is it's not essentially a GI, but foods that are identified as being keystones. Familiar with the term, there's foods that are disproportionately important to the cultural well-being of a people and a place and ecology are brought onto the arc of taste and provided a greater level of exposure, if not legal protection. What I appreciate about slow food is the recognition that simply protecting something is unlikely. So to say this is important and we must protect it isn't enough. It's not going to go anywhere. It's important. We need to protect it. We need to provide market opportunities for those who are engaged in the food production to find meaningful ways to support themselves and be viable going forward. And that's a really tricky line to walk, because for all the reasons that I said, as soon as we start shrinking or eliminating the friction of space and start entertaining these sort of global distribution channels and you know, cost undercutting and so on, it undermines very quickly the whole reason for the initiative in the first place. And so slow food has been, I think, particularly effective at demonstrating how to provide protection and increase recognition, while still realizing that in the reality, these are farmers for the most part, or producers of some form or another, that need to produce and be compensated for their work in ways that don't undermine the viability of that good work into the future. And so that's that's slow food. And I hope I didn't misarticulate anything, or Brooke will jump in here if I did. And back to GIs and whether this might be something for the Conservancy to think about. There's only 26 GIs in Canada right now, and they are all, with the exception of one in Quebec, not surprisingly, all food all wine and spirit. And so there is big moves afoot now to take advantage. Many people are seeing the market attractiveness of this legislation and what it will enable small producers in particularly to do. And so that is likely to change. But Quebec, in their provincial law, has an analogous set of laws that reflect the French/European appellation system. And so there's lots of things that have legal protection, provincial legal protection in Quebec. But the GIs that I'm talking about are coming in at a national level.
Well, it sounds like there is a whole lot of room for us to kind of move into this area, and lots of potential here. I'm noticing that it's 3:30, and so I want to thank everybody for coming and joining the talk. And John, I want to thank you for delivering a really thoughtful
my pleasure.
and fascinating talk. I do have a question for you. Do you have a couple minutes to linger on?
Oh yeah, sure.
All right. So my question, I guess, it looks like to me that there are lots of potential opportunities for local food movement through this kind of GI process, but also some potential risks. And I think about my experience with tequila and mezcal down in Mexico, and the sort of I'm a big fan of mezcals, and tequila I think is kind of awful personally, but it's a huge commercial product, kind of like the champagnes that you were talking about, right? That are more large corporate products now. On the other hand, it provides some cover for all of those small mezcals, which are very much of certain ecosystems in certain places in certain cultures, but which really shouldn't be consumed in large quantities because the ecosystem can only support so much production of that particular kind of item, right? And so I guess to me, the risk seems very much that, say you do have a very successful GI and people recognize the food or the drink that comes from that place. But ecologically speaking, we're talking about limitation here, right? You end up in a situation where really that ecosystem should only produce so much of that that product, or that, you know, the people of that place as well should only be producing so much of that, but the demand is so high. So then you end up in a situation where, you know, potentially either it's unaffordable for people in that place to consume the product that they're producing, or there's overproduction that is damaging ecologically. And so it seems to me that there are risks to success. And I'm wondering if you've seen ways that that can be mitigated, or if I'm seeing things, you know, maybe I'm not seeing things right.
Well, that was the whole. You're absolutely right. I think in terms of articulating those potential risks, but that's why I spent a lot of time building the argument around this idea of boundaries. That these systems have hard boundaries, and those production systems that are producing what we'll call terroir products, or you know, something that's worthy of a GI, are being produced under the ecological constraints of that system. And so that's where so back to like the Normandy cheese, excuse me, the two camemberts I showed, one is produced in vast quantities and has all the kinds of challenges, ecological and otherwise, that you would probably you can think of. Whereas the other is the traditional handmade basket cured cheese that by definition cannot be produced at the scale of production of the other. Does that make one worse than the other? Well, it depends on the metric that you're using. Perhaps the more expensive one is out of reach of, you know, some subsection of the populace, and the other one, the cheaper camembert, is within reach. You know, should we take that into consideration? Well, probably. I would also ask, well, is camembert a necessary? And you know, does it say somewhere one must eat camembert? I mean, that's a whole nother ball of wax. But if the GI, and for the most part, almost all GIs, at least that I'm familiar with, are drawn up as a protection of the culture, and the quickest way to homogenize a culture is to industrialize it. And so embedded in these systems are the priority of cultural integrity and protection, and thereby also creating boundaries around overproduction, homogenization, and creating externalities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The friction comes back to, well, now you're producing a premium good that is with a premium price. Yes and no. The average consumer in France spends a little more than twice what the average Canadian does in terms of their purchase of food. But the levels of food insecurity are actually much less. And so, you know, we're very quickly getting into large sort of systemic kinds of issues that go well beyond, well, do we have a GI or not?
Yeah, I can see that. That's very much the case. If we all spent twice as much on food, that would open up a lot of possibilities for food diversity.
Well, but also had the capacity to support more transparently support local producers. Mm-hmm. Because you know, there's a huge hurdle to get into food production these days, and you know, and I'm not talking about land prices and equipment prices and, you know, consumables and all that, which are astronomical too, but to actually engage in the value chain is really difficult at a small scale. That you have to be assured of success, you need to engage at scales of economies of scale that very quickly reverse the undermine why you got into it or may have gotten into it in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, lots to think about here.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And if there's no more questions, I think we'll thank you very much. Appreciate your time, John.
My pleasure. I hope to all see you soon in person before too long.
I look forward to it. Well, we welcome
Okay.
you out anytime to the food forest and the Nuts and Mud Forage Forest to try some of what we've produced here.
Great. Look forward to it.
All right.
Okay.
Bye for now.
So long, folks.